Okay.
And I'll do science.
Right. So you might have guessed by now I'm not from Baltimore or Washington DC.
That's all right.
I don't have a Liverpool accent though. I'm afraid I can't treat you to that either. I've lived away from Liverpool for far too long. I've lived in Moscow for 12 years before coming here last year, and in the course of that 12 years I was traveling all over Russia studying religious life. So I imagine, I don't know, but I imagine that if you think of religion in Russia at all, you might think of maybe a Russian Orthodox church with golden onion domes, maybe something like in the Kremlin. And one of the most interesting and surprising things I found about religion in Russia is how diverse it is. So what I'd like to do is just introduce you to some of that diversity and read a few extracts from my book, which is coming out later this year. So, okay, so this is from the introduction. Russia's deepest association is with faith. To Americans, the United States is God's country. The English, after William Blake's vision, supposed the Son of God once walked upon their nation's green hills. With perhaps only Palestine, however, Russia is graced in popular perception with more than divine protection or visitation. She is herself holy or imbued with the divine. According to this view, faith directed Russia's path towards statehood and empire from distant origins in the early medieval proto-state of Rus, or rather one particular faith, Orthodox Christianity. As recalled by the Slavonic Primary Chronicle, little more than a century later, in 987 AD, Grand Prince Vladimir of Rus chose Byzantine Christianity for his realm over Islam, Judaism, and Western Christianity. The clincher, as the Chronicle would have it, was his envoy's awestruck response to the splendour of church worship in Constantinople. We knew not whether we were in heaven or on earth. We knew only that God dwells there among men. Orthodoxy would go on to become Russia's defining creed, most vaunted in Tsar Nicholas I's ideology uniting faith, power, and nation. Orthodoxy, autocracy, nationhood. Melding nation with the sacred inspired veneration of Russia herself. Non-rational immersion in the transcendence as experienced by Vladimir's envoys came to be seen as prerequisite for an appraisal of Russia's true essence. In the celebrated 1866 verse of poet Fyodor Tyutchev, Russia cannot be known by the mind, nor measured by the common mile. Her status is unique, without kind. Russia can only be believed in. Ironically, it was through rapid and vast territorial expansion, fueled by this messianic zeal, that Russia incorporated alternative faith cultures, including those rejected by Grand Prince Vladimir at her inception. Their challenge to the unitary model of nationhood centered upon orthodoxy was further confounded by Russia becoming, rather than acquiring, an empire into the 1700s. The solution was a protectionist religious policy that skirted the issue of integration by tying faith to ethnicity. While certain faiths, including Catholicism and Islam, were tolerated if they were among outsider ethnicities, such as Poles and Tartars, imperial law sealed the dominance of the Orthodox Church. It alone could engage in mission, and apostasy from orthodoxy was treated as a punishable offence until 1905. Major strides towards recognition of the true multiplicity of worldviews in Russia were taken in the early 1900s, but imposition of atheist ideology from 1917 proved a great leap backward. In spiritual terms, the enforced collective pursuit of a bright communist future was merely a subversion of Russia's previous sense of messianic destiny. With the Soviet collapse of 1987 to 91, the dilemma over a unitary versus pluralistic religious national identity resurfaced. the new reality leans even further towards the latter than a century before. The Russian Federation, still covering approximately an eighth of the Earth's landmass, is surely the world's only nation-state encompassing sizable centuries-old communities of Buddhists, Christians, Jews, and Muslims. Okay, so I'll just read a couple of short extracts that introduce these couple of different minority communities, and the first one is the Old Believers. So by the 1600s, Russian civilization was widely considered guardian to the purity of Orthodox Christianity. On founding Moscow's Patriarchate in 1589, Patriarch Jeremias II of Constantinople proclaimed that since the original Rome had fallen to Catholic heresy and the second Constantinople to the Turks, your great Russian kingdom, the Third Rome, has surpassed all other kingdoms in piety. By the 1650s, however, there were two notions of Russia's messianic role. Moscow Patriarch Nikon envisaged his church as the hub of a wider Orthodox empire, requiring that liturgical texts and practices be stripped of allegedly uncanonical accretions. Others saw meticulous devotion to Russia's old beliefs and rites as essential to Orthodoxy's preservation. To these old believers, Nikon's numerous, now seemingly trifling reforms, such as the sign of the cross made with 3 fingers instead of 2, were a renegade strike at the very body of the church that not even a patriarch could rightfully make. The 1666 Church Council that branded opponents of reform schismatics was particularly ominous, for the Book of Revelation had identified 666 with the Antichrist, and corruption of Russian orthodoxy, it was thought, would precipitate his coming. As Nikon's camp gained the upper hand, its opponents were viciously persecuted. In his epic 19th century painting Boyarina Morozova, Vasily Surikov depicts an old believer noblewoman, defiant, her right hand aloft in the form of a 2-fingered sign of the cross, as a sleigh draws her to the monastery prison where she will be slowly starved to death. Unknown numbers of humbler figures were tortured, hanged, drowned, hacked to pieces, or beheaded, more often burnt. The old believers' goal then became the preservation of their inner spiritual integrity at all costs, often through total withdrawal from the corrupt church and society. Those known as Nyetovtsi, from Nyet, the Russian for no, rejected all traditional hallmarks of the established church, including icons, simply turning eastwards to pray and confessing to the earth. In an even more radical response, thousands in the 17th century chose to escape the clutches of the Antichrist by self-immolation. A less final alternative to risky confrontation with oppressors of belief was afforded by a more immediate outlet, Russia's vast expanse. Karp Likov went so far as to succeed in completely isolating his family from Soviet influence. In 1978, a group of Soviet geologists stumbled across the Likovs, who had been living deep in the Siberian forests for 32 years. The adult Likov children had never seen lemons, matches, or a horse. Their father knew dimly of World War II, but flatly refused to believe that people could have landed on God's lamp, the moon. Shown a reproduction of Surikov's Boyarina Morozova, however, the family instantly picked out the true believers. Their practice of old belief was perfectly preserved. So the other group that I'll introduce you to is the Buddhists, who are also spread in 3 regions of Russia. Mongolian and Tibetan monks first brought Buddhism to Buryatia, later Russia's principal center of the faith, in the early 1700s. At that time, the wild frontier of a burgeoning Russian empire, this Siberian region to the east of Lake Baikal was already homeland to the Buryats, a nomadic people closely related to the Mongolians. They adopted the Gelug, or Yellow Hat, school of Tibetan Buddhism, historically the dominant of its four main traditions and placing the most emphasis on monasticism. Despite local government officials' unease at the spread of the alien faith, Russia initially banked on a lenient policy towards Buddhism, preventing the Buryats from falling under the influence of China's Qing dynasty, then in control of neighbouring Mongolia. Reversing this policy, Tsar Nicholas I's 1853 statute on the Lama clergy of eastern Siberia prohibited construction of further Buddhist temples, by that time 34. With a stepping up of Orthodox missionary activity in the late 1800s, quote, "It was not unknown for clerics to kick in the doors of unbaptized Buryats, drag them to missionary stations, and pressure them to accept baptism. Some recalcitrant Buryats were beaten, imprisoned, and tortured by the police. Cossacks, missionaries, and priests until they agreed to convert. Others were simply bound hand and foot and christened by main force. The Buryats held fast to the Buddhist tradition, however. By the early 1900s, they had built a further 3 temples, and the Lama population had mushroomed to some 16,000. After the Buddhist Kalmyks migrated from their West Mongolian homeland of Dzungaria to Russia's Caspian steppe frontier in the early 1600s, they too were long granted a free rein as a valuable buffer against the volatile Muslim south. But in 1741, the Tsarist regime forced the autonomous Kalmyk Khanate to sever ties with its spiritual authority, Tibet. The Kalmyks' response to growing Tsarist influence, including over their religious affairs, was blunt. In 1771, the majority, some 30,000 nomadic households, set off back to Dzungaria. Most did not survive the trek across Central Asia. Those left behind continued to defy government restrictions on Buddhist worship. In their formal petition to become a Russian protectorate following the fall of the Qing dynasty in 1912, local leaders of the southern Siberian region of Tuva similarly emphasized their determination to keep to the Buddhist religion and to choose our own spiritual representative. Okay, so finally, I want to just focus on that last region of Tuva, because it's particularly interesting because you get both Old Believers and Buddhists in the same region. And this isn't actually from my book, it's something that I wrote after visiting Tuva in 2004. Tuva attracts a particular sort of visitor. It was most famously discovered by US physicist Richard Feynman, and a 1980s documentary, Tuva or Bust, charted his ingenious attempts to thwart Soviet officialdom's insistence that it was a closed zone. But then Tuva is a particular sort of place. Along with the crumpled hills and fenceless steppe familiar to neighbouring Mongolia, this tiny land has camels to the south, reindeer to the north, and the kind of saltwater lake in which you can read a newspaper. The temperature routinely hits 100 Fahrenheit in summer and minus 40 in winter, when the capital city's cranky heating system covers everything with a layer of soot. Besides that vowel-less capital, Kizil, Feynman was intrigued by Kume, or Tuvan throat singing, whose most skilled practitioners are able to produce 2 entirely different melodies simultaneously, one a deep-throated rasping, the other a nasal whistle. On the surface, a typical Soviet city, Kizil, meaning red in Tuvan, moves to a quite different rhythm. Lilting nomadic vocals drift from the Hume center downtown as daughters of Tuva, the Republic's only all-female ensemble, rehearse. Down the road, crimson-robed monks sway to Tibetan mantras inside a blindingly white new Buddhist temple. Their abbot claims they do not compete with the drums of the city's burgeoning shaman drop-in clinics, such as Tos Der, 9 Heavens, and Adig Eren, Spirit of the Bear. For an untainted Soviet experience, though, there is still the Hotel Kizil. Guests requiring their room keys should remember to address not reception, but a woman on the 3rd floor behind the first door on the right. Only not between 1 and 2 p.m, as she's on her lunch break and will shout, inches from your nose. The hotel has no telephones, no elevator, and no breakfast, unless you count instant coffee sachets and jars of Moldovan prunes. Nor, for 2 months in the summer, does it have hot water. Told the different prices for rooms with and without baths, 2 forlorn Turkish backpackers query in brave Russian, but without hot water, a bath, what is its significance? We escape along one of Siberia's great rivers, the Yenisei, which has its source in Tuva. After a couple of hours along a steadily worsening road, followed by a wooden platform ferry crossing, we reach Camp Vasilievka, 3 log cabins in a field of cornflowers, mint, and hemp. It is run by backwoodsman Vasily Apatyevich, who receives tourists in summer and bear hunting parties in winter. Of special interest in this predominantly ethnic Russian area of Tuva are the isolated village communities of Old Believers along the Yenisei's upper reaches. Opponents of 17th century reforms to the ritual of the main Russian Orthodox Church, the Old Believers first came here to evade persecution under the Tsarist regime. Here they preserve the old ways. Headscarved women and bearded men in homespun smocks greet each other with the archaic, "Do you live in good health?" On Sunday morning, however, the adults in Erge village are recovering from their 1 a.m. 6-hour church service. Cows, pigs, and turkeys roam the village unsupervised, as do flaxen-haired children and wild-eyed teenagers on Soviet motorcycles. After traveling to Erge on Vasily Ipatyevich's motorboat, we decide to cover the 7 miles back to the camp on foot through the birch forest, silent by the occasional scuttle of a surprised woodpecker. Along a riverbank stretch of path, a beaming Old Believer suddenly appears, carrying a pail of milk and a jar of honeysuckle berries. "Do we live in good health?" he asks. "Are we from far away?" His eyes widen. "Well, may your souls be saved."